On a muggy August morning in the quiet southern town of Blue Ridge, a man in a worn plaid shirt, scuffed sneakers, and tired jeans stepped out of an old car and walked toward a police precinct that didn't know what was coming. That man was Richard Nelson, and what no one inside the building knew was that he wasn't just another face on the street. He was their new police chief. But today, he wasn't arriving with lights flashing or a camera crew filming a grand entrance. No, Richard came undercover. No badges. No fanfare, just a man on a mission to see the truth, the unfiltered, unpolished reality of the department he was about to lead. As a black man stepping into power in a precinct whispered to be infected with racism and misconduct. Richard knew this wouldn't be easy. He didn't want polite handshakes and staged smiles. He wanted the real thing, the raw culture, the casual conversations, the way officers really treated strangers who didn't look like them. And what he saw, what happened just minutes after he walked through that door? It was worse than he imagined. What came next would flip the entire precinct on its head and leave one arrogant cop completely destroyed by a truth he never saw coming. This is more than a story of justice. It's a wake-up call, a reckoning, and a masterclass in leadership under fire. Stay with us, because this is the moment the man no one recognized becomes the leader they never saw coming. The hallway was alive with morning routine. Phones ringing, footsteps echoing, coffee brewing, but not a single soul looked twice at the man walking in through the side entrance. Just another tired face in a scuffed pair of sneakers. Richard Nelson took it all in with silent calculation. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a cold sheen on polished tile floors. Laughter spilled from the break room, casual, unguarded. No masks. This was what he came for, the truth beneath the uniform. But then, a voice. "Hey, Sharp," mocking. "You lost, buddy?" Richard turned slowly. Walking toward him with the swagger of someone who'd never been told no was Officer Daniels. White, mid-40s, arrogant, the kind of man who carried his badge like a weapon and his power like a game. His uniform was crisp, his smirk sharper. "This ain't no shelter," Daniels sneered, loud enough for the others to hear. A couple officers nearby leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes hungry for drama. "Whatever you're looking for, it ain't here." Richard said nothing. He just stood there, watching, waiting. Daniels didn't like that. "Are you deaf?" he spat, taking a step closer. "I said, get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." There it was. The moment. The emphasis on you wasn't subtle. It never was. Laughter erupted. Nervous, cruel, familiar. Richard clenched his jaw. He could feel the slow burn rising in his chest. A mix of anger, disbelief, and restraint. Every instinct screamed to put the man in his place. But he stayed still. Daniels, now inches from Richard's face, leaned in. His breath reeked of bitter coffee and ego. "You hear me?" he growled. Then, spit at it happened fast, but it felt like slow motion. A warm, wet stream struck Richard's cheek. Time froze. Conversations halted. The officers who had been laughing fell silent for a second. Then erupted again, louder, nastier. Point one slapped a desk, roaring with laughter. Another muttered, "That'll teach him." Richard didn't flinch. Not visibly. He simply reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded white handkerchief. With slow, precise movement, he wiped his cheek. The room watched, waiting, curious, confused by his calm. Then he spoke. "Is this," he asked, his voice low but steady, "how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" Daniels chuckled. "Only the ones who don't belong." More laughter, but it didn't touch Richard. He looked at them. Not with fear, not with rage, but with something far more unsettling. Clarity. He saw everything. The toxic camaraderie, the arrogance, the complete lack of humanity, without another word. He turned his back on them and walked down the hallway, not in shame, but in purpose, and in that moment, they didn't know what they'd done. But he did it. He had what he came for. The camera would follow him from behind as he disappeared around the corner, the jeers echoing, the spit drying, the lies hanging heavy in the air. Little did they know, the man they just tried to humiliate wasn't the janitor, wasn't a vagrant, wasn't some nobody from off the street. He was the man with the power to change everything. To rewrite the rules. To expose the rot. To flip the precinct on its head. And the reckoning was only just beginning. The intercom crackled. All personnel to the briefing room. Repeat. All personnel to the briefing room. The laughter faded. Coffee cups were set down. Chairs screeched against tile floors as officers slowly filed into the large room, still riding the energy from the morning's entertainment. Daniels was there, of course, arms crossed, leaned casually against the wall like a man on top of his kingdom. Still smirking, still untouchable, he thought he'd started the day with a win. What he didn't know was that the game had already changed. Across the room, conversations buzzed. "You see that guy earlier?" someone whispered. Daniels straight up spit on him. Dude just wiped it off and walked away. Classic Daniels, another chuckled, putting riffraff in their place. And then, "All right, settle down." The voice of Captain Harris, deep and gravelly, cut through the chatter. The room stilled. All eyes turned toward the front where the captain stood, his face unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back. "As most of you know," he began, "Chief Caldwell officially retired last month. We've been operating without formal leadership since then." Daniels looked at his nails, clearly bored. "Well," Harris continued, "today that changes." A few heads perked up. Daniels yawned. "I have the honor of introducing someone who's served over 20 years in law enforcement. Someone who's worked undercover, led major task forces, and brings with him a vision of discipline, fairness, and accountability." The door at the side of the room creaked open. Footsteps echoed, measured, unhurried, and then he stepped in, Richard Nelson. Not the man in plaid and sneakers from earlier. Now he wore a clean, fitted suit, a folder in hand, the precinct's official seal stamped in gold. He walked with quiet command to the podium. The room froze, mouths parted. Coffee paused halfway to lips, and Daniels? The smirk on his face drained faster than blood from a wound. His jaw slackened, eyes wide, chest rising and falling too fast. That it was him. The man he spat on. Richard placed the folder gently on the lectern. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he scanned the room, locking eyes, knowing eyes with face after face. Some avoided his gaze. Others stared, stunned. A few tried to smile nervously, and then his eyes landed on Daniels, held there, unflinching, longer than was comfortable. Daniels' body tensed. His face turned a deep, angry red. His arms dropped. The cockiness was gone. His world was tilting. "Good morning," Richard said finally, his voice calm, measured, yet carrying a weight that silenced every breath. "My name is Richard Nelson, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." Silence. A silence that screamed point one of disbelief, point one of guilt, point one of consequences. Daniels shifted. Someone coughed. Another looked down at their shoes. The energy in the room flipped. What was once laughter now turned to the cold choke of realization. "I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "not as your chief, but as a stranger. And what I witnessed in just a few short minutes was eye-opening." A low murmur began, but he raised a hand, instantly silence. "In my brief time walking these halls, I saw behaviors that are not only unprofessional, but deeply unacceptable." He leaned slightly forward. "And let me make one thing clear right now. That ends today." It was no longer just a speech. It was a reckoning. A pivot point. A room full of officers trapped in the moment when the mirror finally turned on them. Daniel's fists clenched, sweat gathering at his brow. Richard never looked away. Not from him. Not from any of them. The room was still frozen. The kind of stillness you get when a storm pauses, just before it strikes. Chief Richard Nelson stood tall at the podium, the seal of the department glinting faintly beneath his fingertips. But it wasn't a badge or title that made him powerful in that moment. It was truth. "Some of you," he said, scanning the room, "laughed this morning. Eyes dropped. Chairs creaked. You thought it was funny. You saw a man you believed had no power, no purpose. You watched him get mocked, humiliated, and you enjoyed it." His words weren't loud, but they hit like thunder. In those few minutes, Richard continued. You revealed more about this department than any performance review or inspection ever could. Daniels shifted in his seat. The smirk was long gone. Now, he looked like a man cornered by his own reflection. Richard's gaze cut across the room like a blade. This isn't just about one man's mistake, he said firmly. This is about a culture, one that has been allowed to grow in the shadows, one where bullying, racism, and cruelty are not just tolerated, but encouraged. A murmur rippled across the room, but no one dared to speak. Richard stepped away from the podium and walked slowly toward the front row. I came here because I believe this department can be better. It has to be, not just for us, but for the community we swore to protect. He stopped. His eyes landed directly on Officer Daniels. You, Officer Daniels? Richard's voice now calm, almost too calm. Represent everything that's broken in this place. Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came. When you spat in my face this morning, you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected this badge. You violated the very oath you took when you pinned it on your chest. A beat of silence. I'm not suspending you because I'm angry, Richard said. I'm suspending you because you're dangerous. To this team, to this community, and to the integrity of everything we stand for. Gasps broke the silence. Effective immediately, Richard declared. Officer Daniels is suspended pending a full internal investigation. Daniels turned bright red. Chief, I didn't know who you were. And that's exactly the problem, Richard cut in sharply. You didn't care to know. You didn't stop to think. Because you assumed that man wasn't worth your respect. And that assumption is why this department has lost the trust of the people it serves. The air was thick with tension, shame, and something else. Hope. Richard looked at the rest of the room. This isn't about punishment. It's about setting a standard. He returned to the podium, shoulders squared, voice unwavering. Let me be perfectly clear. If you cannot uphold the dignity of the uniform, if you think respect is optional, if you believe this job gives you power over others instead of responsibility to protect them, this is not the place for you. He paused, letting the words sink in. But if you're ready to do better, to be better, then we move forward. Together. For a moment, no one moved. Then, quietly, someone nodded. Another officer straightened in their chair. A shift was happening. Subtle, but real. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had drawn the line. Richard let out a slow breath, his tone softening as he concluded. We owe it to the community. We owe it to each other. And most of all, we owe it to the badge. We wear it with honor, not ego, not hate. He stepped away from the podium. Daniel sat frozen, as if turned to stone by the weight of everything he'd just witnessed. Everything he'd just lost. And Richard? He walked out the door not just as the chief, but as a leader who refused to let silence protect the toxic. The meeting ended, but the air in the briefing room was still heavy, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Some officers shuffled out quietly, their usual banter absent. Others stayed frozen in their seats, replaying every word the new chief had said. Daniel sat hunched, jaw tight, avoiding everyone's gaze. But Richard Nelson, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to his office, closed the door behind him, and immediately picked up the phone. Captain Harris, he said, his voice clear and direct. I want everything on Officer Daniels. His record, past complaints, incident reports, peer reviews. I want it on my desk by morning. There was a pause on the line. Then, you've got it, Chief, Harris replied. Richard hung up and sat at his desk, staring at the mountain of policy manuals, performance charts, and untouched case files. His eyes were calm, but inside, fire was burning. This wasn't going to be a symbolic suspension. This wasn't going to be one of those clean up the mess and move on moments. This was war on everything broken inside the walls of that precinct. The next few days were a blur of movement that he walked the halls, not as a ghost this time, but as a force that he greeted every officer by name, that he stopped at every desk, that he looked people in the eyes, and they looked back differently now. Because when you witness a man stand up, face injustice, and take control with poise and principle, you start to question your own reflection. Some tried to avoid him. Others approached with guarded respect. But a A few came forward, quietly, cautiously, like Officer Reyes, one of the youngest recruits in the department. "Chief," she said, almost in a whisper, "can I speak with you?" He nodded and invited her into his office. She sat, shoulders tense. Then she spoke. "I've seen things, heard things. Daniels wasn't the only one. I didn't say anything before because I was afraid they'd push me out. But I want to do better now. I want to be part of the change." Richard looked at her for a long moment, not with surprise but with pride. "That's all I ask," he said gently. "It starts with one decision, then the next." And it wasn't just Reyes. More began stepping forward. Not all of them had stories to confess, but some had questions. Others had ideas. Some simply wanted to know, "What's next, Chief?" And Richard had the answer. Accountability, respect, reform. Every officer, regardless of rank or reputation, would undergo bias training. All prior complaints were to be reopened and reviewed. Patterns of behavior would no longer be swept under rugs. They'd be pulled out, examined, and dealt with publicly. When Daniels filed a formal appeal, claiming unfair treatment, Richard didn't blink. He stood in front of the department's disciplinary board, backed by evidence of a long trail of misconduct, from inappropriate comments to unjustified stops and excessive force. His appeal was denied, and the message was clear. There would be no more hiding behind the badge. Some officers pushed back, muttering about political correctness or overreach. But Richard didn't flinch. "You want to wear this uniform?" he said at a department-wide meeting. "Then you live by its meaning, not its power, its purpose." The precinct began to shift. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The ones who couldn't accept the new direction, they left, quietly, bitterly. But others, new recruits, forgotten veterans, even doubters, started to believe. Because for the first time in years, the precinct wasn't just a place of rules. It was becoming a place of honor again. Richard walked the corridors one evening, long after most had gone home. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but full of possibility, and he knew. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the beginning of something worth fighting for. Change doesn't come with fireworks. Comes in whispers, in pauses, in glances, in silence after years of noise. And in the days following Officer Daniels' suspension, something in the Blue Ridge precinct began to shift. It wasn't loud. It wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. Some officers straightened their backs when Chief Richard Nelson passed by. Others softened their tone when speaking to civilians at the front desk. The jokes in the break room, less cruel, less loud. It was like the entire building had exhaled and didn't quite know what to do next. But Richard, he knew. This was the awkward in-between, the stretch between disruption and transformation, the moment where real growth either blooms or dies. And he was determined to make it bloom. He implemented daily morning check-ins, no rank, no posturing, just officers standing in a circle talking like people. He introduced community feedback reports, real comments from real residents, both praise and complaint, pinned on a public board in the main hallway. Some scoffed, but others leaned in, like Officer Reyes. She was showing up early, volunteering to walk neighborhoods, asking questions she used to be afraid to raise. "Chief," she said one afternoon as they reviewed patrol rotations, "I think we've been overlooking the west side of town, not on paper but in presence. People there don't trust us. I want to try something. Maybe we just show up, not in squad cars. Just walk, talk, be there." Richard looked at her and nodded. "You don't fix history with policies. You fix it with presence. Let's do it." They did, and the change was real. An elderly woman who hadn't spoken to police in years offered them water from her porch. A group of teenagers who used to scatter at the sight of a badge, they stayed, talked, even laughed. But not everyone was ready to change. Some officers wore their silence like armor. Others complained privately, calling Richard's leadership too soft, too political. A few even whispered that Daniels had been made an example of, not because he was wrong, but because Richard wanted to prove a point. Richard heard it all. He wasn't naive. He knew the real battle wasn't Daniels. It was the culture that allowed Daniels to thrive. And culture doesn't flip like a switch. It bends. Slowly, sometimes painfully. One afternoon, he caught Officer Murray, an older patrolman with 20 years under his belt, muttering something under his breath about the chief and his PR games. Richard didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, a few days later, he invited Murray on a ride-along. Just the two of them. At first, it was tense, silent. Murray's hands stayed on the wheel. Richard's eyes watched the streets. Then they got a call. Minor domestic dispute. When they arrived, it was nothing violent. Just a scared teenage girl, her voice trembling, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Richard crouched down beside her, spoke gently, listened, and Murray watched. Back in the car, Murray was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know, I forgot it could be like that." Richard didn't smile. He just said, "So let's remember, it wasn't a victory, but it was a crack in the wall. And that's all change needs. One crack. One light. One person willing to unlearn." In the weeks that followed, more officers began stepping forward. Not with confessions, but with commitments. Commitments to learn, to listen, to lead differently. There were still setbacks. Resistance didn't vanish. But the precinct, once a place of silent hierarchy and unchecked ego, was now filled with conversation. Real ones, hard ones, necessary ones. Richard would sometimes stand at the glass window of his office late at night, watching the hallways empty out. He didn't see perfection, but he saw movement, and in that movement, he saw hope. Not everyone will change, but the ones who do, they'll change everything. Blue Ridge was a small town, but the wounds it carried were deep. Many of its residents, especially the ones who lived on the fringes, the police weren't protectors. They were reminders of fear, of voices ignored, of injustice unanswered. Richard Nelson knew this. He felt it every time he walked the streets without his uniform. The glances, the tightened grips on children's hands, the silent crossing to the other side of the road. He didn't blame them. He understood them, because he was them once. But now he had the power to do something they hadn't been given for a long time. A reason to hope. So he started with something simple. Not a press conference, not a headline, just a visit. He attended a local neighborhood block party. Uninvited, unannounced. Not in uniform, just Richard, a man in a blue button-up shirt and slacks, holding a plate of ribs someone had shyly handed him. Children ran past him playing tag. Music played softly from an old speaker. And at first, no one approached, until a little boy walked up to him, holding a half-melted popsicle. "Are you really the police chief?" he asked, eyes wide. Richard crouched down, meeting him at eye level. "I am," he said with a smile. The boy tilted his head. "My dad says the police don't like people like us." Richard's smile didn't fade, but something flickered in his eyes. "I can't change what happened before," he said gently. "But I promise we're working to be better now. And if you ever need help, you come find me. Okay?" The boy nodded slowly. A small, hopeful smile began to bloom. Then he ran off, sticky fingers waving in the air. That moment, Richard would remember it forever. Because it was real, raw, unscripted, and it mattered. Word spread. Not just about the chief's visit, but about his presence. He showed up to community cleanups, church cookouts, PDA meetings, even funerals. Not to be seen, but to see. To listen, to understand. And as he listened, something happened. Walls came down, just a little. People began to speak, not just in anger, but in memory, in pain. In truth. A single mother recounted how her teenage son was once stopped for walking too slowly through his own neighborhood. An elderly black man, a veteran, spoke of being mistaken for a suspect simply because he wore a hoodie. A Latina shop owner told him about the time she called for help, and no one came. Richard didn't flinch. He wrote every word down. And then, back at the precinct, he shared them, not as statistics, but as stories. "You want to build trust?" he told his officers. "Then you carry their stories like they're your own. Because when we protect a community, we don't just protect their streets, we protect their dignity." Not everyone got it right away. But some did. Officer Reyes started organizing weekly meet and greets in parks. Officer Grant, once skeptical, began mentoring at the local youth center. Even Officer Murray, stubborn, traditional Murray, was seen fixing a broken bike chain for a kid outside a corner store. The community noticed. They didn't throw a parade. They didn't throw confetti. But they showed up to forums, to workshops, to one-on-one conversations. And the most powerful thing, they started saying hello again. Morning, Chief. Hey, officer. Thanks for listening. Small words, but after years of silence, they sounded like music. One night, Richard walked through the heart of Blue Ridge, the sky above him soft with stars, the city quiet, peaceful. He passed a mural that had once been painted in protest, depicting community pain, mistrust, and rage. Now, someone had added a small symbol in the corner, a gold badge, cradled in open hands. He stood there for a while, just breathing, because this was why he came, not to punish, not to preach, but to plant something that might finally grow. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with awareness, with hearts a little heavier and eyes a little more open. Chief Richard Nelson didn't set out to become a hero. He didn't want the spotlight. He never cared about titles, status, or making headlines. He simply wanted to do what was right, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Because real change doesn't come from power. It comes from perspective. It comes from the decision to walk into a broken place, see it clearly, and choose not to look away. Richard's journey through the Blue Ridge precinct wasn't just a leadership lesson. It was a mirror, a reflection of how deeply rooted injustice can become when we stop asking questions, when we stop holding each other accountable, and when we lose the courage to care. And yet, through confrontation, discipline, empathy, and relentless honesty, something began to shift. Not because Richard yelled louder, but because he listened deeper. Not because he punished more, but because he held people to a higher standard with compassion. He didn't rule with fear. He led with integrity. And in doing so, he planted the first seed of conversion, not just in policies, not just in procedures, but in people. As viewers, we often watch stories like this and think, I'm glad someone did something. But here's the truth. We are all part of this story. Because transformation doesn't just belong in precincts and government halls. It begins in schools, in workplaces, in living rooms, and most importantly, in the conversations we choose to have when no one is watching. Richard's story is a call not just to leaders, but to all of us. Ask, where have I stayed silent when I should have spoken up? Where have I judged without understanding? Where have I followed culture instead of conscience? Because the first step toward conversion, the real kind, the one that outlives moments and shapes futures, starts inside. It starts with a decision to collaborate, not dominate. To respect, not assume. To be transparent, not performative. And that decision changes everything. There's a moment Richard once described in a quiet interview. He was asked how he kept going when the change felt so slow. He said, every time I wanted to give up, I remembered that kid, the one who said, my dad says the police don't care about us. And I thought, if I give up, I just prove his dad right. So I keep showing up, even if it's uncomfortable, even if I stand alone. That's leadership. That's courage. That's conversion. And that's what the story is really about. Not just changing systems, but changing ourselves. So if the story moved you, if it sparked something in you, don't let it fade. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt, what you learned, or what you commit to changing. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And most importantly, follow us, because we'll keep telling stories that matter. Stories that challenge, that heal, and that remind us we can all be the start of something better. Because like Chief Nelson, you don't need a badge to lead, you just need the bravery to begin. And if you're still reading, maybe that bravery is already in you. Let's keep walking toward it. Together.